Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. On the summer evening of July 19, 1994, Dan Grigsby was slightly unsettled. He and his wife of 25 years, Dolly, had stopped by the Mercer Mall in Bluefield, West Virginia. The couple was on their way home to Pilgrim's Knob, Virginia, after dropping their 15-year-old son Danny and his friend off at a football camp in the West Virginia town of Athens, almost 80 miles away. Dolly told Dan she wanted to take a detour on the way back to go to the mall. Eager to get inside and check out the bargains, Dolly and Dan agreed that she would head in first and Dan would meet up with her in the Sears electronics department. But when Dan made his way into the mall a short time later, he couldn't find Dolly anywhere. He wasn't too concerned. His wife had likely become engrossed looking around. But the longer Dan waited, the more his concerns grew. It was unlike Dolly to not keep her word about meeting up with someone. This was a woman who called her loved ones if she unexpectedly left the house in case they needed her and she wasn't at home. Feeling conflicted, Dan got back in the car and drove home to Pilgrim's Knob, where he called the West Virginia police. But in the coming months, when the truth about what happened to Dolly emerged, it was, depending on who you asked, either entirely predictable or the least likely thing anyone could ever have expected. Welcome to episode 206, The Murder of Dolly Rose Grigsby. Pilgrim's Knob in Buchanan County, Virginia, is a tiny mining community of less than 500 people. About 350 miles west of Richmond, it's in the far western part of the state, just south of the West Virginia border. Though originally named for the 15th American president James Buchanan, I am in fact pronouncing Buchanan County like locals do. Settled in 1833, it wasn't until over half a century later that Pilgrim's Knob was officially named upon the opening of its very first post office. Situated on the Appalachian Plateau, west of the Appalachian Mountains, the area was a major coal mining source, driving the local economy since the early 1930s. It was a cloudy yet pleasant summer morning on July 19th of 1994, just 74 degrees, when Dolly Grigsby and her husband Dan and their teenage son Danny set out on a road trip. The couple drove Danny and a friend to a football camp 90 minutes away at Concord University over the state line in Athens. 42-year-old Dolly was a house-proud mom, totally devoted to her two children. She was also an active, dedicated member of the Loggy Bottom Pentecostal Holiness Church in nearby Whitewood. Dolly Rose was born on June 4, 1952 in Bartlett, Virginia, to parents Noah and Velva. The Roses were your typical big Southern family, with Dolly being one of 13 children. Her 43-year-old husband, Dan Richard Grigsby, was born around 1951, one of 6 children, to parents William and Florleen. It's not clear exactly where Dan was born, but available records show both his parents were born in nearby Russell County. Dan and Dolly were married on May 26, 1969 in Clintwood in Dickinson County, Virginia. They really did appear to be childhood sweethearts. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Dan was 18 years old and Dolly was just 16. While this is usually unacceptable by today's standards, it wasn't uncommon in the late 60s. When Dolly was around 21 years old, she and Dan moved to Buchanan County, where they raised their 2 children, Diane and Danny. Diane was born in 1971 and Danny in 1979. Following Dan's missing persons report, police wasted no time launching an investigation. Dan told law enforcement that after dropping Danny and his friend at the football camp, he and Dolly stopped at the state park in Hinton, West Virginia, before having an early dinner at a fast food restaurant. The last stop on their road trip, and the last place Dan would see Dolly, was the parking lot of the Mercer Mall in Bluefield at around 5:30 p.m. According to Dan, He let Dolly out at the mall's main entrance while he went to find a parking spot. After doing so, he went inside to Sears, but Dolly wasn't there. After searching for his wife for a while with no luck, Dan got in the car and drove back to Pilgrim's Knob. He reported his wife's disappearance to West Virginia State Police around 2:30 a.m. the next morning. Dan told investigators that there hadn't been any issues out of the ordinary in the Grigsby household. They had weathered the usual ups and downs that come with being married for a quarter of a century, including Dan's chronic pain, which saw the retired coal mine foreman no longer able to work. So Dan was at a loss to explain why his wife would suddenly have run off. The only thing he could think of causing any concern in Dolly's life recently were issues at their church involving one of her closest friends. According to Dan, Dolly had told him the church problems made her want to get away. But other than that, she hadn't been upset or distressed about anything in particular. And it was noted that it was completely out of character for Dolly to just take off without saying anything to anyone. Dan didn't contact mall security before he left Bluefield, but it's not clear why. And it wasn't like the mall was around the corner from their house. If Dolly had come outside to find her husband and her only means of transport gone, it was at least a 75-minute drive home. Yet Dan told police he assumed that she had hitched a ride. Questions remained as to why Dan didn't hang around longer to see if his wife would show up, or at least contact local law enforcement right away. He had waited a full 9 hours before reporting Dolly missing. It's understandable Dan may have anticipated being told to wait 24 hours before raising the alarm, but it did seem unusual because Dolly always let her husband and kids know where she would be. According to the Bristol Herald-Courier, police from Buchanan, Craig, and Dickinson counties, in addition to West Virginia State Police, searched a 4-state area for the missing woman. Law enforcement's multi-jurisdictional search extended to Kentucky and Tennessee, where Dolly had relatives. A detailed description of Dolly at the time of her disappearance was widely publicized. She was 5'7", had a fair complexion, and sandy graying hair that appeared frosted. She had been wearing a light tan mid-length skirt, matching blouse with 3/4 length sleeves, and light green and yellow horizontal stripes with white sandals. She also wore blue prescription glasses and had a scar above her right eye. And she was carrying a brown Anye brand purse. Even though he had waited to report her missing, when he did, Dan immediately jumped into action publicly, doing what he could to try and bring Dolly home safe. He spent thousands of dollars on ads in the Bristol Herald-Courier, pleading for any information as to Dolly's whereabouts. In one of many stories in the newspaper, Dan begged for anyone to make contact if they had spoken to his wife, saying, quote, "If anyone knows anything, we just want them to let us know that she's okay. If she reads this, we just want her to call her family to let us know she's all right." However, as the days and then weeks passed, Dolly made no contact with her family or friends. Her distraught loved ones hoped that something uncharacteristic had happened, preventing her from calling home. Dan was a regular fixture at church, leaning on his spiritual community for much-needed emotional support. But as more time passed, everyone's fears grew. It was increasingly unlikely that Dolly would be found alive. However, with no proof, everything was still up in the air. The disappearance was all anyone in Pilgrim's Knob and the surrounding areas could talk about. In August, Virginia State Police were brought in to assist under the leadership of Special Agent Jack Davidson. By early September, Dan's ads published in the Bristol Herald-Courier were accompanied by news of a $5,000 reward for any information about Dolly's disappearance. That would be over $10,000 today. Dan continued to cooperate fully with police, even taking a polygraph. But according to the Roanoke Times, his results proved to be cause for concern. Out of 10 questions, Dan failed the 3 most significant, asking specifically about Dolly's whereabouts. And by now, law enforcement knew something Dan did not know they knew. Investigators had learned that Dan and Dolly had not stopped by Mercer Mall at all. Police had suspected from the very start that Dan not only knew more than he had let on, but was directly involved in his wife's disappearance. According to the Roanoke Times, discontent bubbled not far from the surface in the Grigsby marriage. Detectives learned things were said to be so bad between the couple that in August 1987, and again exactly a year later, Dolly had filed for divorce. She suspected Dan of being unfaithful and also claimed he had been physically, emotionally, and mentally abusive. But on each occasion, the couple reconciled and Dolly withdrew the filing. Indeed, according to friends of the couple, their relationship had outwardly been back on track by the time Dolly disappeared. In cases where there don't seem to be any leads or sufficient evidence to lead to an arrest, law enforcement relies on the public coming forward with information to crack the case. All it takes is one person. And this is exactly what happened in the case of Dolly Rose Grigsby. In early October, investigators were contacted by a Clintwood man, 38-year-old Mickey Breeding. Mickey was friends with Dan's 39-year-old brother Ken Grigsby, and what he had to say was shocking. If true, it would confirm what police had suspected all along. Mickey revealed that Ken had asked him to help Dan dispose of Dolly's body. On October 5th, Mickey accompanied state police to an area near Tub Run Road in the Jefferson National Forest in Craig County, Virginia. There, he directed investigators to what he said were Dolly's badly decomposed, dismembered, partial remains, buried in multiple brown plastic bags underneath rocks in a creek bed. Mickey also directed them to a separate site a couple of miles away, where a partial human jawbone with an intact molar was recovered, along with 10 other loose teeth, Dolly's underwear, and a blanket Mickey claimed had been wrapped around Dolly's body. One thing missing, though, was Dolly's head. When investigators contacted Ken, they learned that Mickey wasn't making anything up. The next day, October 6th, 11 weeks after Dolly was reported missing, her husband was charged with first-degree murder and using a firearm in the commission of a felony. As Dan Grigsby was immediately deemed a flight risk, and there were concerns he would attempt to target witnesses, he was held without bond. He refused to talk, only asking for an attorney. Police publicly acknowledged that there was a motive for the slaying, but refused to elaborate. If convicted, Dan was facing 20 years to life in prison for the murder charge and 1 to 5 years on the firearm charge. Dan's brother Ken and his friend Mickey Breeding were both charged with the misdemeanor of being an accessory. Until their preliminary hearings on November 8th in Craig County General District Court, both men were free on bond. Along with the partial jawbone, dental records confirmed the remains were those of Dolly Grigsby. At her autopsy, the medical examiner found the wife and mother of two had been shot at least 3 times in the back and chest with a .32 caliber handgun. 2 bullets were still lodged in Dolly's torso, with the chest wound proving fatal. The level of decomposition indicated her remains had lain where they had been found for at least a month. I cannot imagine how painful this whole ordeal was for Dolly's children, Diane and Danny. By this time, 23-year-old Diane was married and living with her husband. They took Danny in without a second thought, later becoming his legal guardians. Remember, Diane was about 8 years older than her brother, who would have been about 15. At Dan's preliminary hearing in early November in Craig County General District Court, he pleaded not guilty to murdering Dolly. He also denied recruiting Ken and Mickey to dispose of Dolly's remains or accompanying them to the forest to do so. At Ken's preliminary hearing in December, though, he had a very different account. He said Dan told him, his wife, and their daughter that he had killed Dolly at Dan's hunting cabin in the forest following an argument, though Ken didn't know what the argument was about. Dan then asked his brother to help hide her body. The court also heard that Dan then told Mickey he had killed Dolly. In the end, Ken waived his right to a preliminary hearing. He would be automatically sent to a grand jury in the new year. Later in December, Dan's bond was set at $250,000. He waived his right to be indicted by a grand jury, opting to proceed straight to a bench trial. In February 1995, Ken was indicted by a grand jury. If convicted, he faced up to 20 years in prison. As the date of Dan's trial grew closer, Ken knew that if he gave up further information, this could only help his own case. Just before Dan's trial began, Ken told police that Dolly's head was buried in his late father's garden. At Dan's one-day trial in May 1995, Commonwealth Attorney Thaddeus Cox told the court that sometime before the murder, Dan bought the .32 caliber revolver from a man in Clintwood, Virginia. Ken Grigsby was the prosecution's star witness. Along with his wife and daughter, Ken testified that Dan told him that on July 19th, he took Dolly on a walk through the Jefferson National Park near his hunting cabin. After briefly running back to his vehicle to retrieve his gun, but telling Dolly he was fetching a soda, Dan caught up to his wife. After helping her over a fallen tree, he shot her. He wrapped his wife's body in a green blanket before dragging her to a dry creek bed. Dan then dug a shallow grave and covered the site with rocks. Ken told the court that Dan, concerned the body would soon be discovered, approached him, who recruited Mickey to dispose of Dolly's remains. Dan paid the men $600 each, about $1,200 today. Dan, Ken, and Mickey drove out to the forest where Ken and Mickey dug up Dolly's body. In order to prevent her from being identified, the men decapitated Dolly before burying her head 2 miles away. The following week, Ken and Mickey returned to the site where Dolly's head had been buried. Upon Dan's request, they dug it up and Ken took it back to Dickinson County. But what he didn't know, either from the level of decomposition or something else, was that Dolly's lower jawbone was left there. This allowed investigators to recover it when Mickey later escorted them to the scene. On a third visit to the forest, Mickey and Ken again dug up Dolly's remains, this time to dismember her. They haphazardly stuffed her body parts into plastic bags before hastily burying them under rocks in a creek bed. In an attempt to divert suspicion away from himself, Dan then went public with his intense focus on searching for his missing wife, hence the ads and the frequent emotional breakdowns at church. But at trial, there was corroborative evidence from other witnesses about Dan confessing to multiple people. Dan didn't take the stand in his own defense. His attorney, Carl McAfee, did his best to argue for the first-degree murder charge to be downgraded to second-degree murder, relying on the prosecution's responsibility to prove intent. Which seems like it would be an easy feat for the Commonwealth, considering Dan's purchase of the gun beforehand. A defense psychiatrist also testified that on the day of the murder, Dan drank beer and was under the influence of 10 different medications for chronic pain and severe depression. The psychiatrist also spoke about Dan's 2 previous attempts at taking his own life, claiming that prior to the murder, he told a psychologist that if Dolly ended the marriage, he would kill her and then himself. For these reasons, the defense claimed Dan was incapable of knowing right from wrong. But Circuit Judge Duncan Byrd Jr. didn't buy it, finding Dan sane at the time of the murder, as well as guilty on both charges. On August 21, 1995, Dan was sentenced to 50 years in prison on the first-degree murder charge and 3 years for the firearm charge. 7 months earlier, in January 1995, sentencing reforms in Virginia saw discretionary parole abolished for felonies committed in or after that year. Inmates would be required to serve at least 85% of their sentence, though they could earn credit for good behavior, which would count toward potential early release. But as Dan murdered Dolly before the new law came into effect, he would be eligible for parole in just another 14 years. And what of Dan's accomplices, his brother Ken and Mickey Breeding? In June 1995, Ken was convicted of being an accessory after the fact and sentenced to 12 months in prison. That same month, the charge against Mickey was dismissed in return for his cooperation with investigators and his information, which directly resulted in Dan's conviction. It's not clear from the available information whether the murder weapon was ever recovered. In subsequent years, Dan has submitted numerous appeals, but all of these have been dismissed. Today, 72-year-old Dan is incarcerated at the Deerfield Correctional Center in Capron, Virginia. He became eligible for parole around 2009 and has applied multiple times over the years, his most recent attempt last year in 2023. These parole attempts have all been denied due to the seriousness of Dolly's murder. Dan's prison records indicate a scheduled release date of April 2033, which would mean he would serve only 38 years of his 53-year sentence. But he will be 83 years old if he lives that long. But given his parole denials to date, it's likely that Dan will die in prison. No real motive, other than the possible argument at the hunting cabin, has ever been established or publicized. But of course, Dolly had already accused her husband of physical and emotional abuse. And since Dolly Grigsby had already filed for divorce twice, perhaps Dan's motive was the same disgusting reason so many abusive men kill their wives: control. Maybe there was a fight that awful day, and Dolly said she was done for good. But Dan had brought a gun and taken his wife to an isolated area. So it would seem he planned to kill his wife of 25 years, the mother of his children, and then coldly having her body dismembered. Dolly Grigsby was only 42 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She had children she loved and future grandchildren to cherish. But it was all ripped away from her by her jealous and abusive husband, who just would not let her go. He would rather see her dead. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by Gemma Harris. As usual, any editorial comments and opinions are my own. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com, and click on the Listener Suggestion tab, or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. This is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages, but please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds, but it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review. I'm also on all large platforms like iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, and YouTube. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.